Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much, Julie. It is an honor to be with all of you again today as we are learning Parashat Acharei Mot. And as Julie just indicated, I ask that folks put their comments mostly into the chat. There will be times when I will pause and ask Julie to read some of those aloud. I am not able to monitor the chat when I'm teaching, so that's the way we're going to navigate the chat. If there is something technically immediate, like if I need to repeat something, Julie, I ask you to please just interrupt me. So if anybody puts in something in there, like, can you please repeat that, or can you please spell that, or whatever it is, please feel free to just interrupt me. But other kinds of questions and comments, we'll be pausing, and we'll be also spending some time towards the end doing Q&A, because I want this to be a very interactive, interactive share, an interactive talk. I want to begin with a couple of notes and disclaimers. The first is a note, which is that we now in the Jewish community are in a very interesting calendrical moment. And this happens every couple of years at different times in the year. It usually happens either right after Pesach, as is the case this year, or in some years it happens right after Shavuot, as I think will be the case next year. But in any event, we are in a situation right now where there are two parshas that are being read this Shabbat in the Jewish world, depending on where you are. If you are outside of the land of Israel in the diaspora, we are reading Parashat Acharei Mot, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. I am in the United States, and we're going to be focusing on Acharei Mot. Why is this the case? Because in the diaspora, there are many communities who observe 2 days of Yom Tov, 2 days of a holiday. And last weekend for us in the diaspora was the 7th and 8th days of Pesach. So last Shabbat, we did not read a Parsha. We read the reading for the 8th day of Passover. In the land of Israel, where Passover is only 7 days, the 7th day of Pesach was last Friday, and then Shabbat was a standard typical Shabbat. So in the land of Israel, they moved forward and read Parashat Achrei Mot last week. There are also communities here in the diaspora who keep 7 days of Yom Tov. Not all communities keep 8 days. I believe that those communities who keep 7 days of Yom Tov, for whom last Shabbat was also a standard regular Shabbat, my understanding is that they read the first half of Achrei Mot and are going to read the second half this week. Someone who might know the calendar of the Reform world a little bit better than I do, please feel free to correct that. My understanding is that in the Reform community, I do not come from that tradition, but I understand that in the Reform community, they read half of Achrei Mot last week and half of Achrei Mot this week. I mention that only as a way of just situating ourselves in the calendar. And we're going to be, of course, focusing on Acharei Mot because that is where we are following the diaspora schedule of Parshiot this year. And so I'm really excited to delve into this Parsha. I also want to note that, of course, we've had this pause in Torah readings because of Pesach, and we are in Vayikra. And Vayikra can be a bit of a challenge for modern readers and modern folks today. And I particularly want to honor all of us who might be struggling with this particular Sefer, this particular book of the Bible, this particular book of Torah. And I myself certainly struggle with Vayikra, with Leviticus. And I think it's really important for us as Jews, as lovers of Torah, as people who study Torah, to not try to push that away, but to honor and accept that it's present without judgment. There is a long tradition that we really, in the Jewish world, rabbis and sages for thousands of years have had a particular posture of deference to Torah, and I think we should really keep that going. I think it's very important, and I think it's really important to honor our own reactions to text. And I don't expect or assume that anyone has any particular orientation to Torah in this room. I assume that we come from a variety of backgrounds. I assume that we come from a variety of religious traditions even. I don't assume that we're all Jewish. So I'm gonna back up and sort of orient us. Where are we? It's been a few weeks since we have been in Vayikra. So I thought it would be good before we really get started on Acharei Mot to think about where we physically and temporally are. So Vayikra, of course, is the middle book of the Torah. And in English, we call it Leviticus, having to do with the priestly class. This is mostly a manual for the priests, not exclusively, but predominantly. And in Hebrew, Vayikra means and he called. So there's a very particular difference in how we even label these Sfarim, these books in English and Hebrew. I'm going to be using the Hebrew title. And we are, I would say, about 2/3 through the way of Vayikra at this point. By the time we get to Acharei Mot, we've had several Parshiot that talk about the sacrifices, particularly in Vayikra and Tzav. Then we have Shmini, and we're going to be talking about Shmini today because the very beginning of Leviticus 16, which is where we're going to be starting, is talking about the deaths of Aharon's two sons, Nadav and Avihu. So we're going to go back. We're not going to go back in the text, but I'm going to reference earlier in Vayikra to explain that verse. So now we have Parashat Shmini, which is the third Parsha of Vayikra, and that is talking about the ordination of the priests. And we also have, of course, the episode of the deaths of Nadav and Avihu. Then we have Tazriah and Mitzorah, which have a lot to do with Tum'ah and Tara, which are often, I think, improperly translated as purity and impurity. And the reason I think that's important to note that the improper translation of purity and impurity is because there's a particular English assumption that purity is morally good and impurity is morally bad. And I actually think for our ancestors, I think that these terms of Tara and Tum'ah are not about physical purity and impurity, but about ritual impurity and purity. That does not, however, obfuscate the need for us to really talk about these issues, which we're going to a little bit, but we're moving sort of out of that area when we leave Mitzorah, which we read 3 weeks ago now, and we move into Acharei Mot. And I want us to look really at the first pasuk to begin with of Acharei Mot, and I'm going to go ahead and read that in Hebrew. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Acharei Mot shnei bnei Aharon v'karbon tam lifnei Hashem v'yamutu. So we have a situation where this parak is opening, this parasha is opening, and it says that and Hashem spoke to Moshe after the death of Aaron's two sons because of the sacrifices that they brought before Hashem. And this harkens back to Leviticus 10:2, when we are told that Nadav and Abihu brought an Eish Zara, a strange fire, before Hashem, and they died. And we know also that Haron Yidom, Aaron, was silent. There's a lot of commentary in that parsha about grieving and how do we think about grieving. But what's fascinating here in this pasuk is that we have this verse that God said something to Moses after the death of Aaron's sons. But if we look at the second verse, we have again Hashem speaking to Moses and telling Moses, talk to Aaron your brother and tell him when he's allowed to come into the Kodesh HaKodeshim and when he's not. So we don't actually know what was said to Moshe by Hashem after the deaths of Aharon's two sons. We have instead automatically jumping into when Aaron is permitted to come into the Kodesh HaKodeshim and into the Mishkan and when not. And again, if we think about this Sefer of Torah as predominantly focused on the Kohanim and on the Levi'im, but mostly on the Kohanim, we have to think about why there is such an emphasis here on the parokat, on the curtain, and if Aaron goes in the right time or the wrong time, he will himself die. And that is a very interesting juxtaposition, that on the one hand, we have this opaque verse that lends itself to lots of interpretation. What did Hashem say to Moses after the deaths of Aaron's two sons? And of course, that's what our Parashat is named after. And then we have this whole larger conversation about, or this whole larger explanation about the Yom Kippur ritual, which we'll get into later in this parak. And we get into this whole explanation of if you go behind the parochet when you're not supposed to, behind the curtain when you're not supposed to, you yourself will die. And there's an interesting parallel here. So why is there such an emphasis on sanctity in this way, and on if you do this thing, you will die, or if you do this thing, it is not a good thing to do? We see this a lot in this Sefer. We see this a lot in upcoming Parashiot as well, particularly in Emor, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks now. And I think it's just important to notice and to note that we have really moved away, and I want to credit a teacher of mine, Rabbi Chasya Steinbauer, for this insight, that we have moved away from an individual relationship with Hashem, and we've moved into a communal connection to Hashem. And ultimately, that's what Tum'ah and Tahara are really about. Tum'ah is a ritual status of impurity, and Tahara of purity, and having to do with when can one come to the sanctuary, how does one become a Tahara after being Tum'ah, what is the process? And so too, we have this annual ritual of figuring out a way to grant kapara, to grant atonement. We read this chapter on Yom Kippur morning as a reenactment of the service of Aharon in the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur, and by extension, the Kohen HaGadol on Yom Kippur. And again, the Kohen HaGadol is only permitted to enter the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur at a very particular time. There in the Talmud, there's an entire tractate called Yomah, where the first 7 chapters of it, it's 8 chapters, and the first 7 chapters of it are really focused on how do you prepare the Kohen Gadol for this ritual on Yom Kippur, because the stakes are extraordinarily high. We know familiarly, some folks may know that part of this is somehow there's a ritual that occurs, and there are 2 goats, and all of the sins of Bnei Israel are put onto one goat, and the other goat, it's drawn by lots, and the other goat goes to Azazel. And there are lots of questions about what does Azazel even mean, but for our purposes, we're just going to say that Azazel means going into the desert. Could Azazel be some kind of demon? We don't know. Could Azazel literally just mean in Aramaic and will go, or it will go, or he will go? There are lots of ways people understand Azazel as a term, but for our purposes, we're just going to think about it as going into the desert. And then there is the I'm just quickly skimming here. There is the goat that goes out into the wilderness, and there is the that is where all the sins go. That Bnei Israel sins go into this goat, and it goes out into the desert. And so there's this whole ritual. And if this experience does not go according to how it's supposed to, there can be tremendous consequences. There is a certain sense of everyone feeling a sense of being renewed. And I just want to name that even as I'm describing this, I'm noticing and feeling disconnected, because this is not something that we actually do anymore. Liturgically, in some communities on Yom Kippur, as is the custom in the community that I most often daven with on Yom Kippur, there is a service during the Musaf, or the additional service on Yom Kippur afternoon. It usually is around 1 or 2 or 3 in the afternoon, depending on how things go that day. But there is a part of the Musaf service called Seder Avodah, which is exactly reenacting this Parashat, this service in the Kodesh HaKodashim. Often it's just read. There are different traditions as to the text of that. Some people have the custom, as is true sometimes in my community, of trying to change different costumes to reflect the different clothing changes the Kohen Gadol went through. All of these different things that get explored in the liturgy of the day as a way of trying to connect ourselves to this rite, R-I-T-E, this ancient ceremonial experience. But yet it's so far from our experience. It's so far from our understanding. And the question really arises, how do we connect to this text? And I also just want to note that when we think about Leviticus, and particularly this week's Parsha, we're going to be mostly focusing on these first few verses here in Leviticus 16. But I want to name, and I think it would be improper of me not to, that Leviticus 18 is also part of this week's Parsha, and Leviticus 18:22 has been a verse of incredible pain for centuries. We need to just name that. And we'll talk about how does that relate exactly to what we're discussing now, but I think it's important to note that. I think it's very important to note that because this entire Parsha, focusing on boundaries and community, of course, we're in the week of Gevurah, so that feels appropriate to be thinking about container and boundaries, and when do we come behind the paroket, and when don't we, and when can we do these different things, and how do we conduct this ceremony on Yom Kippur, and what is the goal of that ceremony on Yom Kippur. There's also a section of our Parsha that we read on Yom Kippur afternoon in many communities that talks about sexual relationships which are prohibited and which are permitted, and mostly addressing Israelite men. There's a tiny reference to women, but in the original text, it's mostly addressing men. In later Jewish law, this gets expanded, and we understand that these things now apply to all, but the actual shot of the text, the original meaning of the text, is really referring to men. So we again go back to our major theme of our Parsha, which is sanctity in a very prescribed and particular way. And I would also say responsibility. That sanctity created responsibility, that ultimately the Kohen Gadol was the conduit for Bnei Yisrael and for Bnei Yisrael's sins, quote unquote, or chata'im, which would probably be a better way to understand the word sin. In English, we often think of sin as this, like, you sinned, you did this terrible thing. But I think in terms of how the Torah understands it, these things kind of give us a sense of tum'ah, and this annual cleaning out the tum'ah in a certain way, and this annual expiation process and kapara process allows us to return in a deep way. And this is a theme that gets repeated a lot throughout the Yom Kippur liturgy, that there is a sense that we are returning to our best selves on Yom Kippur. It's one of the happiest days of the year, especially because if, in fact, the Kohen Gadol emerged from the Kodesh HaKodashim, there's a really amazing piyut that some folks sing, Mare Kohen, talking all about the Kohen Gadol emerging without any kind of injury. And what does that portend for the year ahead? There's also just an incredible emphasis on the anticipation and really the fear. You can kind of imagine Bnei Yisrael is all in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, and in the case of the Torah, in the Mishkan, in the desert sanctuary, and there's a lot of anticipation and fear. What's going to happen? Is the Kohen Gadol going to emerge from the Kodesh HaKodashim or not? How is that going to work? And if not, then what does that say for us in our relationship to the sanctuary and our relationship to God? Because ultimately, we've moved from deeply individual connection to a communal cohesion and connection. So that is where often I feel a disconnect, because I think that our tradition really believes that Achrei, responsibility, is very, very important. That we as Jews, we as human beings, are responsible one for another. I think we see this in our Parsha, particularly because of the way in which Aharon, in this case, has tremendous achriyot on his shoulders. He's ultimately responsible for making sure that the kapara process actually happens the way it's supposed to, that the atonement process happens the way it's supposed to, and that Bnei Yisrael is atoned for and can begin again. And we also are all each responsible for one another. We are all responsible for the choices we make. We are responsible for how those affect us and other people. How do we align ourselves with the best of who we can be? We are obviously not in a time where we even connect to this, except for all of the ways in which I described it happens on Yom Kippur. But other than that, this is one of those rites, rites, in our tradition that it's just kind of, it's so important and it is so central. But because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, and all we have is a zecher, through a remembrance, through the Seder Avodah, which is not even done in all communities. Not every community does a Seder Avodah Yom Kippur. That may not be something you're familiar with at all. And even if you do a Seder Avodah, as is the case in my community, even when we're doing that experience, I know personally, I'm often, I'm really trying to connect to what's happening, and there are full body prostrations 3 times during that experience, but it's so removed from the way we think about Yom Kippur and from the way we do Yom Kippur that trying to connect in a really authentic way that's not performative to this particular experience can be very difficult. And yet, I think it's important to say that this was very important to our ancestors and that there is a lot here that is really significant in terms of ritual and how do we use ritual to be in right alignment with ourselves and with the divine. And so I want to go back to where I began because I kind of skipped over that a little, and I want to go back and really focus there on the very opening pasuk of our parsha. Vayikra Hashem el Moshe Acharei Mot Shnei Bnei Aharon. Hashem spoke to Moses after the deaths of 2 of Aaron's sons. Aaron has 4 sons. Eleazar and Itamar are the only 2 that remain. Nadav and Avihu are died because of bringing in Eish Zara to Hashem. So we've got this pasuk here, which is clearly important. The rabbis understand that every letter in Torah is omnisignificant. So omnisignificant means that every letter in Torah means something. Every single letter in Torah, this is there's one school of rabbinic thought called the Akivan school, and that's what I'm referring to now, from Rabbi Akiva, who was a very important sage of the Mishnaic period in the land of Israel. And he believed that every single letter, every single word of Torah has infinite meaning. So we have this verse here that proceeds this very long and intricate explanation of the Yom Kippur ritual. So why? What is Hashem saying to Moshe after the death? Acharei Mot Shnei Bnei Aharon. Before Hashem then says, speak to Aaron, your brother. There is so much space there. We don't have any dialogue recorded. So part of what I think we get to do as interpreters is think about what could be going on there. Why is this verse important before we go into the larger explanation of the Seder Avodah, of the order of service on Yom Kippur with regards to Aharon as the Kohen Gadol? And we know if we go back to Leviticus 10, where we hear about the deaths of Nadav and Abihu, that Nadav and Abihu died again because they brought a foreign, an Eish Zara, an unasked for korban to Hashem. Which you might think to yourself, well, that's a little bit weird, because isn't it a good thing if you want to show your piety, you want to show your devotion, that you would bring a korban that you weren't asked to bring? Korban is the Hebrew word for sacrifice, and the root for that is kuf resh bet, which means to come close to. So a korban was our ancestors' way. Again, this is another thing that we don't do today and it is really hard for us to connect to. It's our ancestors' way of coming close to God, bringing the best, what they had, to God. And so I think that there's a really interesting message here. It might be the case that the Kohen Gadol, being who the Kohen Gadol is, the high priest, the person with the greatest degree of closeness to Hashem in this particular system, which is a little bit anachronistic from how we think about our own relationship with the divine today. It's a deeply individual act and also deeply communal, that we all have access to that thanks to the Hasidic masters, especially, who really said that every Jew can achieve this kind of closeness with God. What does it mean then to have a scenario in which we have two of the Kohen's sons dying because they brought something that they thought was bringing them closer to God that was not asked for? What does that mean about God? What does it mean about us? How do we understand all of that or any of that? Can we even understand all of that or any of that? And I would say that this is an opportunity for us, an opportunity for me to think about action, to think about how I show up in the world. I may not be able to map it on directly to these rituals that we are described in that we are receiving in this week's Parsha, but what are ways in which my actions are aligned with what is being asked of me, both by Hashem, myself, and others? And how do I live a holy life? Ultimately, that's what Vayikra, that's what the Book of Leviticus is all about. In its way, it's about how do we live lives of sanctity and holiness? How do we do so by maintaining boundaries appropriately with ourselves and others? And how do we do so by showing up appropriately in our relationships and in the world so that we can create a better world than the one we were born into? And I think especially that's true in these days, in the last couple of years, with everything we've experienced with the coronavirus pandemic, with all kinds of social unrest, both in the United States and around the world, and all of the ways in which it feels like the social fabric is unraveling before our very experience. How do we show up with alignment, with compassion, and with responsibility? Achrei Mot and Achrei are related because Acharei, after, the root for that is Aleph Chet Resh, which means Achrei or other, and Achrei Mot as a particular idea of responsibility, Aleph Chet Resh Yud Vav Taf, begins with Aleph and ends with Taf, and so it's understood to be an all-inclusive midah, an all-inclusive idea that we are responsible one for another. We are responsible for how we build community, how we interface with ourselves and others and with the divine. So I'm going to pause there, and I want to open it up now to any comments, questions, conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tuchman. Folks are welcome to put their comments and questions in the chat box, or I know a lot of comments came in during the session. If there's something you'd like to re-up, just if you wouldn't mind reposting your comment if you want that to be addressed in this, like right now, and you can use the raise hand function if you want to ask your question. And I happen to see that Esther is waving her hand. So Esther, we will start with you, and then we'll move from there.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for marvelous lecture, a lot of insights. But I got two things out of this parasha. First of all, the value of life. Throughout the parasha, there is so many times that life is mentioned, that we have to choose life. And I connect the Acharei Mot to Yom HaShoah, which we just had, that Aaron, even though he lost his two sons, had to continue with life. And so the people after the Shoah, we have to continue with life. And I remember the rabbi in Jerusalem said, Yom HaShoah, go home and have children. And my second comment was, you talked about the children and the choices we make. And Rabbi Kahana said that the mistake the Aaron's sons did is that they were too arrogant, overconfident, and they didn't ask for any advice. And so they went over the boundary where they should have been. And he quoted the Hebrew expression, "Marbe bechokma, marbe be'etza." They did not ask for advice. And thank you.
Thank you, Esther. That's beautiful. I want to thank you also. I had fully intended to mention that, of course, Yom HaShoah Gvura was yesterday, and that is important also thinking about our parasha. So I really want to thank you for reminding us of that, lifting that up, and bringing that into the space, that there is a lot of emphasis on chai, on life, that we should chai b'hem, that we should live by these commandments. And like you said, that Aaron had to go on after such a tragedy, and that so too we, in the aftermath of Yom HaShoah Gvura, that we also must continue to make Jewish life thrive everywhere we are and in every way we can. And to your second point about Rabbi Kahana, yes, exactly, that there was an idea that that there was that sense of Nadav and Abihu were really arrogant, and that there was consequences for that. I think we have to be really aware of that as well, as human beings living in this world, that it is really easy for us. I notice it within my own self. So I think that it's true of all of us, right? That we can get so arrogant and so sure that the way that we think about a given thing is the correct way to think about it. And we can find ourselves, especially in a world where we live in echo chambers often of people who think just like we do. We can get into a place of assuming that anyone who doesn't think exactly as we do is completely kota machana, so to speak, completely outside of the camp, completely outside of our purview. And I think that we need to be very conscientious of that both of those things exist simultaneously regarding Nadav and Abihu. That on the one hand, we have to find a way to grieve our loss. And I think a lot of us, especially in this time, are dealing with complex grief in ways that we won't necessarily even fully uncover. I think that I am of the feeling and of the belief that the last couple of years in particular are going to be with us for decades to come, that this is not something that we're going to somehow get over and move forward from. We're going to be with this for decades, and we're going to constantly be uncovering new levels of the losses we experience. And we also, our tradition is one, as Esther, you mentioned, that is really focused on hope and on continuing to move forward and continuing to bring life into the world. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, Oriel puts in the chat, I'm asking one of those questions that you're told not to ask in Hebrew school. Do you know of any sources that speak to if the wilderness goat wanders back to camp? You probably wouldn't be able to.
Oh, that is such a fascinating question. I am not familiar with Ane, but I love that question, and I look forward to digging into that. I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but no, I think it's a fascinating question. So thank you for that. And I wish I had some. Anyway, if anyone on this call does know of any sources that talk about that, please do bring them in.
If I remember correctly, in the Mishnah, the goat is pushed over a cliff, but
yes.
So it may not be wandering back anytime soon. Any other questions or comments? Feel free to speak up now.
Are there any other comments in the chat, Julie, that you think would be helpful to bring into the space?
Well, Jennifer, I hope I answered your question, Jennifer, who had asked about why we're out of sync. So I answered that in the chat, but Jennifer, let me know if that wasn't clear. And in the meantime, Betsy, go ahead.
Oh, well, this is not that important, but we had sheep that came and ate our grass and stuff and ivy, and they said they no longer use goats because goats wander off, and they do not. They wander off in completely different directions and they don't come back. And sheep stick together so they can go find them. So I just wanted to share that about the goats. I don't think they come back. but that's just from my personal experience.
Thanks, Betsy, for
Thank
sharing
you,
that.
Betsy.
Alan.
Hi, I'm an addiction medicine physician, and I work with people with alcohol problems. And I've used this parsha because, you know, one of the things you didn't mention is immediately following the deaths of Aminadab and Abihu, Moses tells Aaron that God said not to have strong drink within. So I've used this. I have a presentation that I do about chemical dependency in the Jewish community, and I put this as the first potential. I know that there's not a lot of strong rabbinic support for this being the primary reason that they went in drunk as opposed to the strange fire, but I've used it together with Lot and his daughters, and Cain and his, Noah and his sons, and many other injunctions against excessive use of alcohol. So just wanted to make that as a comment.
Thank you very much for bringing that in. That's so important, and particularly because we don't talk nearly as much as we should in the Jewish community about issues of addiction and recovery. So the more we can bring our sacred texts into that conversation, I think the better, because it destigmatizes it and it lets folks know that they have a place, inside of the camp, as it were. But I think that note that you mentioned, you're right, I did not mention that about Aaron not being able to have strong drink. I think that is very important to bring in as well to this. So thank you.
I often use that as a counterpoint to people who talk to me about Purim, and
Yes.
the need to be drunk on Purim. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we have 2 more hands raised, so I think that we will have time for hopefully both and then be able to wrap up. We'll start with Don and then go to Julie.
Yes, I have a question about the goats. I came across the name Azazel, and if I didn't know what that meant, because the first goat was Azazel, was sent off into the wilderness. So I really didn't understand why there is the suffix L after the name of the goat that was sent off into the wilderness, because I have always connected the suffix L with the Lord. I don't know why it's attached to the name of the goat that bears the sin of the people of Israel.
Yeah, your question is one that scholars have been trying to figure out, and rabbis and commentators have been trying to figure out for a long time. You're right that El as a suffix does mean God, and that can be used not only to refer to Hashem, to Elohim, to the God of Israel, but also there are references to like Elim Acharim, like other gods that we're not supposed to worship. And so that word of El does refer to divinity in some way. And so Azazel as an actual term is quite opaque. There are lots of understandings of what it could mean. Some of them are derived from Aramaic about he will go, as in the goat will go to Bamidbarah, to the wilderness. Or it could be some kind of goat demon. That's something that I've learned as well. I'm not sure how much, I don't know how much fact there is in that particular idea that Azazel was some kind of goat demon from the region, from the land of Israel and surrounding cultures. But there are a lot of questions about that. And so, yeah, I hope that answers at least partially the question, but it's a really important one that scholars of Vayikra have been trying to figure out for a very long time. And I think we have one final hand.
Yes, exactly. Julie, go ahead.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Rabbi, for this beautiful learning together. The person 2 people ago who talked about not drinking, not drinking after the death of Aaron not drinking after the death of his sons. And I was just curious, because my recollection is that Hashem said that Aaron couldn't even mourn, and that when he went back to his wife, he wasn't even talking about it. That was my recollection, and I was wondering if that was a correct recollection or not.
Yeah,
And
Julie,
if it is, it's very disturbing. That's one of the hardest parts, if that is the case, for me to accept.
yeah, I hear you, Julie. I really hear you. That is also how I understand it. There's a line in there that says "V'yidom Aharon," which means and Aaron was silent, meaning that Aaron. There's clearly a reaction. He's lost 2 of his sons. He goes back to his wife Elisheva. We don't even hear from her. Right? So like putting that into context, like we don't even hear from Elisheva, and what did she think about all of this? After all, she lost 2 of her sons as well. And, you know, I think that is really complicated for us today to think about. You know, what does it mean? What does it mean that Aaron wasn't able to mourn in the way that now our tradition really prescribes mourning as a critical piece of the grieving process? And so I have no answer other than to say that, yes, I mean, that is a deeply distressing component of this. And what do we do to do a tikkun in our own way? Meaning to say, what do we do with this sacred document of ours and make sure that we honor all forms of grieving? Because I don't think our culture does a very good job of that. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to really think about how we could do better at that.
So my question, yes, I hear what you're saying. My question is, was he instructed by God to not mourn or grieve? Or was it just the comment that he was silent?
I don't recall there being direct instruction from God. I recall it more as the comment that he was silent, but I would truthfully need to go back and do a close reading of Leviticus 10 to be able to give you a better answer. But my immediate recollection is that there is not a direct instruction not to mourn, but it's just that he was silent.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. I think we'll bring it to a close from here. It was beautiful learning with all of you. I hope to learn with you again in the future. And I want to turn it back over to Julie.